I was thinking a lot about the fiscal spending problem in the US, and we should talk about the Fitch rating downgrade that happened this week. I've got some data I'd like to share. One thing I was thinking about was how tied the age of Congress is to our fiscal spending problem. If you think about someone who's young, they're going to want to invest for their future and think about the future. If you're someone who's old, you live for the day and you don't think about the future. And I worry so much that the aging of the establishment that makes the decisions about how money is spent creates a psychological barrier
incentive.
Or positioning that's all about giving away all the money today instead of making the right decision to make sure that we have a prosperous tomorrow. And that's why I think so many of these things kind of slip through. If you put a 20-year-old in charge that was well-informed, in charge of some of the fiscal policy, environmental policy, energy policy decisions, defense policy, it would be a very different set of decision-making than someone who's in their 80s.
Inheritance tax.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
so
pensions.
Anyway, we should talk. You want to talk about the Fitch downgrade? Because I think it's a really important story this week.
Fitch, the rating agency, downgraded the U.S.'s long-term debt by one notch from AAA to AA+. Only 9 countries have AAA ratings from the top 3 rating agencies, S&P Global, Fitch, and Moody's. Those are Germany, Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Singapore, and Australia. What you can take from that is you got to have a good balance sheet and you have to have high-functioning governments. The highest functioning governments in the world are the Nordics. That's why you see Denmark, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway there. According to NPR, the negative reaction hasn't been as strong as 2011. That was the first time the U.S. was downgraded from AAA to AA+ by the S&P. That also had to do with the debt ceiling. The markets kind of largely shrugged off the Fitch downgrade. Main reasons for the downgrade is obviously higher interest rates, aging population, the debt to GDP ratio, which we've talked about here. But government kept coming up over and over again, and how dysfunctional our government is. And the debt ceiling is one of the key manifestations of that. Your thoughts on this? For the first half of the show, Friedberg, you're an optimist, but are you now going to switch to declinist?
I wouldn't say declinist.
Are you going to switch to declinist mode now, or are you still in optimist mode?
I mean, in JCal's view, unless you're a cheerleader for every stupid government policy, you're a declinist.
I know. It's JCal, listen, I want to be honest. I don't think so. I think and I concur. I think you can highlight that there are concerns with U.S. fiscal policy that are putting us in decline in our spending spiral with the U.S. currency reserves, which there are now diversification efforts underway. And I'll talk about this in 1 second. And that doesn't mean that the U.S. isn't the most exceptional place to do engineering and entrepreneurism and have freedom of speech and thought and so on. But there are elements of the U.S. that put things at risk. So let me just point out these 2 charts. If you guys pull the first one up, this is a pretty striking chart, and I think I showed this before. This is federal government interest payments that are being made. We're now up to, $1 trillion. The chart, as you can see, a year has spiked. And by the way, that number is spiking further, and we'll talk about this in 1 second, as a result of rising interest rates and increased fiscal spending. So this is now becoming a pretty sizable part of our budget. And as of now, paying the interest on our debt is a larger capital outlay for the federal government than defense spending. The second chart shows what happened in the last week, which is that 30-year treasuries have been sold off. And as that's happened, treasury yields have climbed. So there's been about a 10% decline in pricing and a concurrent nearly 10% increase. And Bill Ackman, basically said today that he's shorting 30-year treasuries. He thinks we're going to go to 5.5% long-term rates. Currently, the 30-year treasury is sitting at 4.3. And remember, I told you guys this after this thing I went to a few weeks ago, that there were 2 prominent economists who shared that they think we're going to be facing long-term rates in the 5 to 7% range, very long-term rates for a very long period of time, that it is a new fiscal regime. And then if you pull up the last link I sent, Nick, this is a report made by the Treasury Borrowing Advisory Committee of the Treasury Department. And I just want to read a couple of quotes from this report. This just came out today, and it was published. It was sent over to the Secretary of the Treasury yesterday. And it said, since the advisory committee convened in May, 2-year treasury yields are about 100 basis points higher, while 10-year treasuries have increased by about 40 basis points. The bank holdings of non-mortgage-backed government securities, mainly treasuries, have actually declined by $146 billion so far this year. So that means banks are selling off their treasuries. The committee goes on to say, at the same time, Treasury investors have noted the Treasury supply will need to increase to address the rise in public deficits as tax revenues have come in weaker and government spending has increased. Issuance needs will be additionally impacted by the timing of a recession and so on. Then they said, based on the marketable borrowing estimates published on July 31st, Treasury, this is crazy, Treasury currently expects privately held net borrowing of $1.007 trillion in this quarter, with an assumed end of September cash balance of $650. And then they said we expect another $852 billion of borrowing next quarter. That means Treasury is going to try and issue and sell $2 trillion worth of Treasury bonds in the next 2 quarters. That's $2 trillion of new borrowing by the federal government to pay our bills. At the start of the year, they were estimating $1.6 trillion for the year, which was an insane number. Now we're talking about $2 trillion in just 2 quarters. So rates are climbing. As a result, we need to borrow more. And this is a perfect manifestation of the debt spiral problem that we've talked about multiple times. Our fiscal spending outlay and the rising interest rates combine to create an insurmountable debt spiral that is now manifesting in the fact that we need to sell $2 trillion of treasuries. And here's the crazy statistic that they said. In reviewing recent demand for U.S. treasuries in auctions, the committee noted that an increasing percentage of supply is being absorbed by investment funds, while foreign participation has remained range-bound. That means as we're trying to sell more treasuries, foreign governments are buying fewer of them, which means that the U.S. currency as a reserve is no longer the place that everyone wants to plow their money as much as it used to be. It is in decline. Now, the other thing I want to share, which I think is absolutely critical, is how do we address this gap? Well, the one way is these entitlement programs. And so several Republican presidential candidates, Nikki Haley, Ron DeSantis, and Mike Pence, have all publicly stated on the campaign trail that they're promoting programs to cut Social Security benefits for people that are 30 and 40 years old. And here's the response to that. So they've gone out and they've started saying that. A poll was done. And on that poll, 82% of voters oppose the push to cut Social Security for Americans under 50. 82%. So where is this going to take us? This is what is so scary to me, J-Cal. I'm not an American declinist. I believe in the American system. It benefited me and my family. But I do worry that we find ourselves in a whirlpool that is very hard to get out of because the populace says we don't want to make the cuts that are necessary in order for us to save ourselves. That's what's so scary to me. And I've said it before. I think it's worth saying again. That's it. I'm done.
It's not a problem with populism. I mean, the elites are saying it too. There's no appetite in the DNC to cut or reform Social Security. Are you kidding?
It's very unpopular. How do you get elected?
I don't know why those Republicans.
How do you get elected saying?
I hadn't seen that article. I would advise all those campaigns not to touch that rail. They're going to electrocute themselves. I think Trump has the right political instincts on this point, which is you cannot touch Social Security as a single party effort. It has to be bipartisan. And there is no bipartisan will to do anything. So I think you're right about the larger point.
Chamath, your thoughts on Friedberg's manifesto that 80% of the public does not want to cut spending. They're in favor of Social Security for people under 50 years old. And we have $1 trillion in debt payments. And we're in a death spiral because we're borrowing
$2 trillion. In 180 days, we're borrowing an extra $2 trillion.
That's the real point.
The fiscal end of days.
At the start of the year, the expectation was they were only going to borrow $1.6 trillion for the year. Now we're borrowing $2 trillion in just these 2 quarters.
Let me just state what I think about the downgrade. It's irrelevant. The S&P did it 13 years ago. Fitch is a marginal credit rating agency. They're at a minimum 13 years late. At a maximum, they're just anxiety-ridden, like other people are, who are always screaming that the sky's falling. So that's my first point. The second point, and the more important one, is that none of you who are always freaking out about this understand this conversation about relativism. All of these conversations are relative. You deal with them in absolutes. On a relative basis, Japan's debt to GDP is 270% and growing. On a relative basis, our debt to GDP is half of that. We are the most important economic force in the world. It is going to continue to be the most economic force in the world. And all I see actually on every single monetary basis is every other country struggling more than we are.